So, a slight pivot, but I think you address this in the book as well. On this show, when we interview entrepreneurs and operators, one of the questions we always ask is how they view the importance of their team and company culture to their overall mission and objectives. So, I'd love to kind of hear your take and advice on that particular issue.
Yeah, it's so important, and we do in the human ocean. We talk about first of all your early employees and what they look like and what should be expected of them, and it's we kind of see two different ends of the spectrum. We see companies that as they start to scale, they go out and they hire the rainmaker, right? The salesperson who had great success with one other startup or one other technology company, and it costs them $250,000 a year and some equity, but that person's going to revolutionize the business, and that almost never happens. So putting kind of all your eggs in one basket. But the other end of the spectrum are those enthusiastic but perhaps naive founders who say, hey, I'll just get a bunch of interns from the local university, and I can get 5 for $30,000 a year, who are fresh out of school and energetic and smart, and they'll pick it up. Well, not having any experience and having a lot of resources that are less capable and also perhaps less adaptable to wearing different hats early in their careers can be a similar kind of burden. So having that balance of experience and capabilities that you're willing to invest in and pay for, with some energy and enthusiasm and some less perhaps skilled or experienced folks, having that balance of resources and not overpaying is a very delicate one for startups. But we have a specific Detberg called the crazed culture Detberg. And the example we use actually comes from a local, very successful tech startup, but they went through the roller coaster that a lot of startups do in their early years, and they had this gong, and every time they set this kind of culture up where we're going to celebrate success, and every time they made a sale, the salesperson would get to ring the gong. Well, as they grew, other functions started saying, hey, how come the salespeople are the only ones who get to ring the gong? We should do that if we have like successful uptake on our marketing campaign, and that drives more inbound traffic, or for our product developers who are working late nights. So all of a sudden it became, okay, so these are the categories of things that are gong worthy. So let's offer that opportunity. So all of a sudden the gong's going off, like every 15 minutes for somebody. And eventually the salespeople were like, because they're like the coolest kids on the block, right? And they were like, we're not going to ring the gong anymore because it's not like special. So you guys go ahead, knock yourselves out. And the company and the economy kind of went into a little bit of a tailspin. So all of a sudden, instead of every 15 minutes, the gong was like eerily silent, maybe once or twice a week. So kind of adapting your culture over time, similar challenges, which I think would resonate with founders who have been through a scalable, where they set up this practice of going out to lunch on the birthday of, employee number 5. And that works great until you're at employee number 250 and you're spending, almost every day going out to lunch with an employee. So being cognizant of the culture that you're creating, but also being aware that will change, perhaps subtly, but change in not the core values of that culture, but in how they manifest, how you actually exercise the key aspects of your culture, and recognize that those specific practices and tools to reinforce the culture are going to need to grow with the organization over time and with different economic circumstances, et cetera.
I think sometimes one of the challenges we see is that people think culture is emergent. We don't have to decide what we're going to do. We'll just get a bunch of people in the room, let them do stuff, and then we'll see what works, and then we'll all move forward together, right? Well, that also doesn't work. And so you really want to be mindful of where do we want this to grow to, and what's important to us within this. Our mission and vision are the terms we often use, but that everybody can kind of get around, and then ask, well, what processes do we need in order to ensure that? Like, how would this look if this is what we said we wanted to be? And I think that you're seeing a lot of that even in this crisis, right? So there's lots of different ways to think about how you deal, particularly if you're in a non-essential business right now, with your employees, right? So you could fire them all and they go get unemployment, right? But if you are actually a benevolent company and you think of your employees as your family, there's a message you're sending when you just axe them all, right? And so then, well, do you give them severance? Well, how's that going to work? So do you furlough them, right? So furlough typically means you're not paying them, but they stay on with health benefits. Well, again, does that fit with what you promised and what you think you ought to do? Or do you keep them on and you try and find business loans to cover it and the tax write-offs and hope for stimulus, right? So 3 really different ways of dealing through this crisis. And it should come back to your culture versus, one executive I was talking to just was like, well, we're going to pick the cheapest way for us. I'm like, whoa. Like before this, there was a talent shortage. Cheapest way for you is maybe not the first criteria you should be thinking about.
Yeah, I think I love what you were saying about not just assuming culture will be emergent. And I was thinking that exact thing after kind of listening to your overall advice, that it's like, yeah, I mean, this takes planning and to be purposeful and mindful about how you do it. And I think that's definitely what I see a lot, is that it's unfortunately a rare entrepreneur who puts time and energy into the planning of that piece of it. I more often see people talk about the importance of it, but I think that there is that underlying latent belief that, oh, because I'm nice and the people I'm working with are nice and we're all gonna be nice together, that it'll just emerge the way we want it to.
Right. And then what happens when it doesn't? And people, look around. Are people friendly? Aren't they friendly? How are they in the office? Aren't they in the office? Right. So you can have lots of different styles depending on what it is you want to accomplish and what, you think is the reason for being there.
And I think importantly, some people neglect to recognize a lot of what culture is formed by is what you choose not to do. And there are always trade-offs that organizations have to make in any kind of strategic choice, but having clear limitations on what you will not do, what you're not willing to do with your key stakeholders, with your customers, products you're not willing to develop or sell, and customers you're willing to say no to because they're either too costly or they're just not a fit with your business model and your value proposition. Those are things that are very defining of a culture as well, and should be made explicit.
When we talk about the team and that impact on the overall achieving the entrepreneur's objectives and the company's objectives, I want to pivot a little bit to talking about specifically co-founders and investors. Your views on kind of and advice on what operators should be thinking about and how they pick their co-founders and their investors.
Yeah, and our first ocean that we talk about is the human ocean, and the founders are the first category, and co-founders. And just to share, one of the biggest mistakes that we see a lot of entrepreneurs make is both to allocate equity, all of the equity early. So 2 co-founders, over a cup of coffee or a beer or something, start a company and split it 50-50. One, splitting 50-50 is a really bad idea. You should have one person that is the primary decision maker at least. And 2, equity should be earned over time commensurate with progress of the venture. So you don't start out by allocating 100% of the equity until you're actually making real progress and who's kind of pulling their weight. So whether you have 2, 3, or more co-founders, again, don't allocate all the equity and have that equity vest over time commensurate with contribution. And that's one of the big mistakes that we see with co-founders.
And I think what happens is people just aren't willing to have the hard conversation. It feels too business-like for friends. And maybe you get an attorney involved, but you need to lay the parameters out. You need to talk about what behavior is acceptable and what behavior isn't acceptable. I mean, we've seen some horror stories where there were multiple co-founders in one state and went bankrupt. The couple of them came here. The third co-founder reached out to everybody in the community with let them know about the failed the bankruptcy back there. And it's like, wow, you all really had a bad conversation. So, get it in writing. I mean, there is a reason that prenups happen for marriages. So, I mean, they feel icky. It's an emotional thing, but actually it's a smart thing. It'll actually make you operate better because you know what the terms of your agreement are.
Another piece of that, and whether you get it through co-founders or through advisors or mentors, is that diversity of perspective. And it's not unusual that co-founders maybe work together, maybe went to school together, maybe from a socio-demographic perspective are very similar to each other. But particularly if you're trying to sell to a market that is outside of your demographic, you certainly want to have either some co-founders or at least strong advisors involved who bring diversity of perspective and experience. That really decreases the chances of you sailing around in a sea of false hope for too long.
What about when it comes to forging relationships with investors? I think on the surface, the superficial analysis might simply be, well, I need money, this person has money, let's do this, right? What are kind of the broader considerations or the experiences that you might share on that point?
Yeah. So again, you need to do some homework. I mean, your investors are going to be with you for a while. I mean, in the 10 years, 15 years we've been investing, I think we've had one exit, right? So that means that we are partners with you for 10 to 12 years. And so again, you want to look for somebody who can help you in the business you're building. They know something about it. You want them to complement what you're doing so that they're filling gaps for you. You also want to know what their expectations for returns are. I mean, I've seen a pretty awful situation where one investor expected to be paid back with the next investment round, right? That's not going to happen. Nobody is going to sign on to pay somebody else for an exit. And they went bankrupt. Seen some other things where like the investor wants to know every month, how are we doing? What can I do to help you? Let me come over there. Oh, wait, you're not doing it right. Let me help you, right? You don't want that either. Likewise, an investor doesn't want somebody who never updates them. So your investors are there to help. You need to be willing to reach out and ask for their help. So finding, somebody that you are copacetic with. And what we usually suggest is start by trying to put together an advisory board and see how the advisory board relationship works and who are you going back to and asking for more help. And then maybe you open the door to that's an investor that you want. So definitely thinking strategically. And then there's some investors that will help you get other investors. And so you might think like, who are the early, more risk-taking folks who will add legitimacy for the next round, where who your investors are becomes even more important.
As Kim was suggesting, really doing your homework and knowing whether you're the kind of stage and in the kind of vertical market that an investor operates in, right? Because you don't want to waste your time and burn bridges. And if you go too early to some investors, the reality is, even if they might have looked at you later on, if you're too early and you go and are not educated and savvy in your approach to them, you may burn that bridge for eternity just by not kind of doing your homework. Ask to talk to, well, you don't ask them, but talk to portfolio companies who are part of their investment portfolio, because they will have perspective. It is a two-way street, as Kim was suggesting. It's not just we're going to take money from anyone who we can get it from. You want fit. You want fit between your needs, the advice that they will provide, the support. It's not a one-time transaction, so you want investors that are willing and interested in making subsequent investments, so they don't kind of spend all their capital on you in the first round. Particularly if they're the only investor. And then as you need growth funding, you're going out and creating new investor relationships. The other thing that I see in a number of kind of entrepreneurial markets is what entrepreneurs think of as the not invented here syndrome, meaning entrepreneurs are early on, they don't really have product market fit yet, and they go out and they kind of knock on local doors, to kind of the most likely suspects, right? The 3 to 5 angel investing groups or active angel investors, and they get turned down. Well, through that whole journey, they've gotten beaten up a bit. They've gotten educated. They're also getting closer to product market fit. And then they go to kind of an adjacent city. For Indianapolis, it might be Cincinnati or Louisville or Chicago or something. And they actually get some interest. And the story they tell is, nobody around here would give us any money because investors around here aren't willing to, invest locally, and they think they have to go elsewhere. But the reality is, if you go too early and you kind of burn your most likely local prospects before you've done some of those things to establish product market fit and show that you can actually scale, any savvy investor is going to say no. So I often, Kim and I have this conversation with a lot of entrepreneurs. Don't burn your best customer prospect as your first conversation, right? Learn what the hot points are, the talking points, what language they respond to. You can actually research that and learn that through interactions with customers that might be on the margin or you might feel are not the best fit, but at least you're learning from that discussion. And who knows, they may surprise you. But if you are then armed with the experience of that conversation, when you do start going to your top 3 or 4 prospects, you'll be much better served by having been through that.
He had to remind me of that about 6 months ago, because I had a list I needed to climb through, and I'm like, oh, I'll just focus on my best ones first. And he's like, stop, go further down the list, not to the bottom, maybe halfway down.
At least the first 5 conversations. Just go somewhere. Yeah.
So the book, The Titanic Effect, it's bringing together kind of what seems like years of experience and work and research on your part into something that can be digested by startups and investors and people interested in business out there. Now that you've done that, what's next for you? What comes next? Is there a follow-up to the Titanic Effect, or what do you foresee in the future here?
We're still trying to figure out if we have product market fit.
and depending on the day of the week, it's either, there are 4 more books like this. We particularly are attracted to the social ventures and not-for-profit sector, and there are very similar challenges that they face, but they manifest differently. The specific Detbergs, if you will, look and feel different and need to be addressed in different ways. Scaling companies, and we kind of stop our most of our the iceberg index and kind of tools are applicable through launch and early growth in the first part of scaling, but not going from 50 to 500 employees there are similar kind of concepts and the framework would apply, but the Detbergs that they tend to run into are very different. So there are extensions that we could invest in. As you may know, writing a book is just it's not just writing a book. It's a little like having a baby in that, it's not like once you have the baby, it's like, ooh, okay, now that's done. The hard work is actually just starting in many ways. And with the book, it's somewhat similar that in terms of the support of it, the ongoing kind of conversations and how much you're willing to invest, both in terms of time as well as dollars and the opportunity cost of it, are a challenge to navigate. And I think we're still in that how much do we want to support even this book on an ongoing basis, let alone investing in taking on something else? But we have it at the same time. It's really rewarding and gratifying to hear back from the entrepreneurs, in many cases now, people who we don't even know and have never known, who are getting benefit from it and applying the concepts. And it's now kind of shifted over the last year from where were you 3 years ago to I now have my list. I actually have a plan. Or from some investors, it's really helpful to them because it gives them a language and a framework. And instead of just saying, we're not investing because we don't think you have product market fit, for example. Well, to the entrepreneur, that might be kind of like, well, now they can say, here's the section that I highlighted. Here's what product market fit is, and here's why you're laboring in this area of either false hope or so. Anyway, I think for the supporters of startups, and including perhaps some folks in your audience, having a language and something you can point them to that allows them to navigate. So you're not trying to do all the heavy lifting as an advisor. That certainly is a nice kind of outcome from the feedback we've gotten.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us. We had today Drs. Kim and Todd Saxton here with us. The book, The Titanic Effect, can be found on Amazon and other major booksellers. You can get more information on their website. I'll post a link to that in the comments section here. And yeah, thank you. We appreciate it. We appreciate your time and the advice that you've been able to give me and our audience here today.
Now, I have to tell you that as a CPA, I thought you might have a little trouble. We often say, you're taking on hidden debts. And we've had some financial people say, wait, debts are financial. How are we talking about these hidden debts? How can, this marketing decision be a hidden debt? And so I'm really glad that you have a broader perspective that debts are not necessarily just dollars.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, hidden debt, it lurks in businesses. And you mentioned technology companies. You may familiar with technologies have that concept of the, well, now I forgot the word, but it's
technical debt.
Yeah.
Technical debt. Yes. The technical debt. And we have that in accounting too. I often tell our clients or some of the people that we advise that, hey, especially the tech companies, you're familiar with technical debt. Well, we have that in accounting. You may have a lot of technical debt that has to be cleaned up here. So, I think, there is a lot of things beyond just the obvious financial I owe somebody that are out there and challenging the businesses.
Awesome.
Well, thanks. And for those in your audience, again, appreciate you listening in, and also good luck navigating these challenging times for everybody, and hopefully you'll emerge stronger on the other side.
Thank you.
So I thought I would just update all of our accountant listeners. If you're a CPA exam, if you're on the horizon for taking the CPA exam, or if you have CPA credits that are set to expire, the boards have actually a new continuous testing model has been released for CPA exam candidates, and it's going to debut on July 1st. And this is from NASBA, the National State Board of Accountancies. And so under this continuous testing model, candidates will have the ability to take the test year-round without restriction, other than waiting to receive scores from previous attempts of the same section when there's been a major change to the exam. So this, for people that don't know, under the old system, there was a 2-month on, 2-month off kind of testing window that you would have to sit through. And often you would get a notice to schedule, which would give you a 6-month window to schedule the test that you had signed up for. And if you didn't pass those tests, you would have to wait for your score to be released and then wait for a testing window to open and then pay another fee to get in there. Under this new plan, you'll be able to turn around immediately after you get your score results and reschedule a test immediately within that same window. Of course, pay for it. But it should lend itself to people being able to take more attempts at the CPA exam and allow for a more fluid kind of run through. And this is being done to try and help alleviate people like in my boat. I have 2 more CPA exams to take before I get mine. my credits don't expire until October, but depending on how long this lasts could be really depending on when I get to take the test. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. If you guys have any comment on it, I'd love to hear it.
I think it sounds like a good change. I think it seems like something that should be. I never fully was all behind the logic for the 2 months on, 1 month off. I know it was kind of to split up their workload a little bit, but beyond that, I never saw too much significance in it. So yeah, I think this sounds like a change for the good.
Do you have any sense of, does this change kind of the quality of does this mean anything about the actual knowledge of the test taker, that they're able to take it right away? What does it mean, if anything, about that?
I hadn't really contemplated that. What I do think it probably is advantageous to are those memorized, if you're a memory learner, or a crammer, I guess, and you kind of get more attempts at the test during your testing window, then you have literally more attempts to memorize what you're trying to do. But I don't necessarily know that the CPA now, I definitely have met CPAs on both sides of the coin, where very good CPA with a CPA, or a very talented bookkeeper or accountant that doesn't have a CPA. So I don't necessarily know that a CPA license speaks to the quality of accountant like I think maybe it used to. It's definitely like a hurdle that one has to get over and maintain continuing education. But I don't necessarily know if it would lead to lower quality accountants having the designation. I'd be interested to hear what your guys' thoughts on it would be, though.
Well, I mean, my first thought on it is I'm wondering how they're going to be able to implement not having cheating happen. If you're online at home, are you able to use a second computer to look things up? I wonder what they would do about that. I know that a lot of the questions are set up in such a way that you can't really Google it or something.
But to be clear, they're not doing away with the testing centers where you have to show ID and go into a sealed room and all that. They're opening up the testing ability. You'll still have to go in person and prove that it's you. Only use the test on their system, their closed system. So that portion of the test is not changing.
I see.
Yeah, but I think the intuition behind, historically, besides the logistics of grading and all that, some of the intuition philosophically behind causing some period of time to have to occur between attempts is to discourage taking the test multiple times back to back with the intent on just getting lucky one of those times to essentially pass. And I think that, to your point, AJ, about, well, does taking the test and passing it actually mean anything toward the quality of you being an accountant anyway? I think that's definitely a valid discussion, a potential argument. There was one of the podcasts in this year from a group of people that I follow and think could do a good job like us on putting out content. They're called JX4. They had got all into that discussion, and I would encourage people to kind of look at some of the back and forth on that. I think it was probably episodes back towards either January or February timeframe that I saw that. And then there's lots of other great online discussion about that. So I definitely think that's a valid question or discussion. But if we're talking about a scenario where we've already decided we are going to test people and credential them. So we're already on the side of saying the credential matters and that the test in some respect must matter. So now that we're talking, if we're going down that road, then does it dilute the value of it by letting people just take one right after another? Pushing you on that point, since you're in that zone of having to do it, right?
But I think it's a fair question, and I think there's also been a lot of discussion over maybe the dilution of the CPA kind of like anointment, or what that means over the years, when I think the same kind of argument was made when they moved from having you do all 4 tests in one shot on one day to then 4 separate tests that you would have to take. Wow, that's so easy. You only have to study for one part of it. When in fact, the reason why they changed is the amount of requirements that they had in the test it would be impossible to do all 4 on one day. Was really the way they moved it. But there was a big argument, I think, at that point where it devalued the CPA exam. So then are we saying that it dilutes it even more now? I think I think it'll bear out in the numbers, just the same way like we were talking about how cyclical a business is. They're going to have to make this move to make those people that are in that boat like I am, or even in a worse boat where their credits expire. I think they're really making this move to accommodate those people. And I think that then the numbers of the amount of people that passed and the percentage passed will then also bear out whether or not this is diluting it. Because if you see a giant jump in the amount of people that are passing the exam and the pass rate soars through the roof, then I think you could make the argument that given the extra time and the availability to be able to take a test, fail it, and then retake it again, and I think you could make that argument that then that made the test easier and you're allowing more people to have that designated license.
Yeah. Well, I mean, arguing against the question I asked too, I think even if this does result in more people passing the exam and more people getting the license, I think that's a complicated issue and nuanced in the sense of I wouldn't necessarily say that dilutes the license, because it could be that having a larger number of a diverser population of people who are able to obtain the license actually makes the body of license holders a stronger group of people with more power and meaning to it as well in some regard. So I don't believe that it necessarily needs to be. I don't believe that the nature of it needs to be artificially elitist such that it just culls the numbers of people that pass the exam. I don't think there's any reason for that to be arbitrarily a goal of the process. And indeed, if this kind of change makes the process better and easier for more highly qualified people to pass the exam, and so that we can be more inclusive and have a larger population of highly qualified people, then great. And I think that's the nuanced discussion that's difficult to really measure. It's like, well, are you diluting it so that just anybody can pass the exam and become a CPA, and it's not necessarily a larger group of more highly qualified people, or are you expanding the tent such that you're bringing in a diverse set of highly qualified people who just make the whole profession better? I'm not smart enough to figure that out here, but I think I would say those are the interesting discussions and arguments around some of that kind of thing.
I think here's one point that we haven't brought up yet, and I think this is my kind of argument about the dilution of it, would be that I think that the onus on the CPA licensure, I think the onus on continuing to be, if you have that designation and continuing to be a contributing member and elevating the profession, I think that lies a lot on the continuing education requirements and the ethical requirements that happen after the license is issued, and not necessarily about the test itself. The test itself is a gateway to know that you need to know these basic things about those 4 subjects, and you're able to then recite those things in a test. The practicing of being a CPA, I think, is being ethical, knowing your shit, and then having the continuing education to be able to deliver on those 2 things. And I think that's much more on an onus of after the fact of having the CPA, of keeping the quality of having the CPA designation, much more than the exam or the ability to pass the exam.
That's a very interesting I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, you've kind of framed a question here in terms of, if you had to prioritize, is it better to have a stronger gate or a stronger set of continuing requirements if the priority is to maintain a high quality profession? And I totally, yeah, I think I would lean towards what you're saying, that a stronger set of continuing requirements over a long period of time would lead to a stronger profession than just having a really strong entry point, a really strong gate at the beginning of it.
I agree.
I might want to put out there too that I'm not arguing for more CPE a year. I just want to.
Well, yeah, maybe I am, because maybe we can create it and sell CPE here. So whatever, but yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, I take it back then. We need probably 120 hours a year,
Yeah. And it can be done via Zoom.
Yes, yeah. And courses need to range from about $1,200 to $2,500 a piece to keep your.
Yes.
So, what do you got, Charlie? What's next? I think we beat this one to death.
Yeah, so no, I think that was a good discussion though. And yeah, I just want to say I agree with the CPE being the major thing, especially in a changing industry. So yeah, the other article I had that I wanted to talk a little bit about is that I found an article where Shaq was being criticized, Shaquille O'Neal was being criticized for missing too many board meetings after he was brought on board to Papa John's board of directors to try to help revamp their image and to try to, boost sales. And basically what happened is that Papa John's paid him about a little over $8 million to be a part of things. And then he's appeared in a very low percentage of the commercials, and he's been to like maybe less, I think it said less than 75% of the meetings since then. And so, it's one of those things where it was an idea to bring him on to revamp their image, but he's a really busy guy and has, we were talking about it before the podcast, but he's involved in a bunch of franchises. He's in Five Guys, he's in Auntie Anne's and Krispy Kremes. And so I guess I'm just trying to get your guys' feel on whether or not it was a smart move for Papa John's to enlist such a busy person to, to fix their public image. And so, yeah.
I actually have really strong opinions on this one. So, but I don't know if anybody's had a chance, but they really should. And this was recommended by Ethan, the producer of the podcast. If anybody has a chance, they should check out the H3 podcast of the Papa John's interview. Now, it's done as kind of a comedy podcast, but if you listen closely to what the Papa John's is, John Shatner, the founder of Papa John's, what he's talking about, it's a really interesting business case study, I guess is the best way to put it. He just lays bare, in fact, how much money he was given when the company went public. He talked about the interaction with the board. He talks about his outing, and one of the interesting things he talked about was Shaq being part of the board and on board for the marketing portion of the thing. He made an interesting point. And he said that he loved that Shaq was part of it, and he said that they were misusing him. And the reason they were misusing him is he was only in something like 10% of the advertising that was going out for Papa John's. And you had the brand kind of before that being Papa John's, and then you bring in Shaq, John gets ousted, you bring in Shaq, and Shaq's only in 10% of the marketing. If you have somebody with such a powerful brand and such a powerful footprint in social media and in the business world, that he should be on 100% of the ads, and that they were underusing him. And I think if that was the case, you probably wouldn't see this kind of blowback. I think if he was allowed to use his brand and his wide reach. And Shaq's been a very successful entrepreneur. I think in the stats that we ran down, I think he owned at one point 155 Five Guys or something like that. Just an outrageous amount of franchises. He's kind of the franchise king with Krispy Kremes, Five Guys, Auntie M's, Papa John's, and then he has auto dealerships. I know he has nightclubs in Vegas. I know he has a chicken restaurant in Vegas. So his fingers are in everything, and I think, $8 million can't be that. I hate to say it this way, but it can't be that much money to Shaq, to be honest. Because
John's
or to Papa John's, and if you're paying that kind of money, I think you would have him on the advertising and the board meetings be damned. I don't know. That's just my personal opinion, but I'd like to get Ty's view on it and see.
Well, I think of course, if you're the company, you would want him on everything, right? And so I guess the push-pull on this that wasn't clear to me from the story was, I mean, was Shaq even available to be on everything, right? And when you think about it as a business transaction, you can take it both ways, because as you point out, $8 million is probably not that much to Shaq. And if you put that in the context, if it's not that much to Shaq, is he really going to spend the time to have his face and his image on everything, and or allow for that necessarily, and so I think that there's a question there. I mean, what did $8 million really buy is the question, and there's potentially an expectations mismatch. What did it buy in Shaq's mind, and what did it buy in the board's mind, or whoever's criticizing on this, and did their expectations actually align? I mean, that's the piece of it. I think from a business standpoint, from my perspective, that's it. I mean, it's yeah, of course, yeah. If you could use Shaq's image and him for all your marketing, you would. But did $8 million really buy that for them is a different question.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I didn't take into, and I think this is probably the problem with when these kind of what would normally be an internal discussion in a business becomes a public discussion of a business, because I think in private you would have access to that kind of knowledge of what he signed up for and what that $8 million paid Shaq for and bought for Papa John's, as far as like what was involved in that contract. And having the discussion in the public sphere, you're privy to only a small part of that, and it's, I guess, whatever spin, whether Shaq's on the wrong or Papa John's is on the wrong, depends on who's reporting it. And so I think with with limited information on something, I would have to say that I agree with you, Ty. You probably need to go back and, assume that probably both parties got what they paid for, especially under a guy like Shaq who knows contracts so well and has been in so many franchisee contracts, and leave it at that, probably.
Well, and I mean, you can still criticize you can assume that and criticize the transaction, just say they may have valued it $8 million and we wouldn't have, right? And if you recast, like what you mentioned, what John himself was saying, if you kind of just say what he was saying in slightly a different way, in other words, if I were running the company and I spent $8 million, I would have insisted that I got Shaq on everything. That's a different way of saying it, right? That really puts the exchange in perspective, right? Because, yeah.
Well, I think it speaks to a very fundamental concept that we've talked about before on the podcast, is when you enter into a transaction, that's whether you're employing somebody, you're somebody's boss, you're contracting with something, there's a give and take to that, a 51-49 split of some type. And it needs to be for the transaction and the employment arrangement or whatever we're talking about, for that to work out correctly. Both parties have to be aware of that 51-49 split, and they have to sign off on it and agree to that for it to be a healthy relationship.
Totally, I agree with that. And the more that the results are built into the agreement, that's going to be what drives the overall satisfaction. So I think, yeah, it's having it clear and having it be what you want in the outcomes. So, and it sounds like that just was not the case in this whole deal. So yeah, what do you think? You got another article we can chew on?
I do. I got one more here. So this one is kind of we're back to the coronavirus, but this one is related to so the stimulus checks, so they're being, we talked about this last time, but the stimulus checks are being dispersed from the IRS. And this article out of Accounting Today kind of went through the $1,200 stimulus check for people. If you don't have direct deposit set up through the IRS, or they don't have banking information from you from the last 2 years to make direct deposits, those checks are going to have to be issued via snail mail. And so the Accounting Today article actually walks through the math. So it says that the IRS will send approximately 100 million checks at a rate of 5 million per week, which could take 20 weeks, according to the committee's document. This is from the Means and Way Committee, meaning that the final round of payments may not go out until September. So people expecting, like especially old school people that would get their refunds in checks, or if they owed the IRS and paid with a paper check over the last few years, the stimulus check could take up to looks like 3-4 months to get to people. And a lot of those people probably are older. My mother, I know, has to make quarterly estimates because she has some real estate activity, and so they wouldn't have her direct deposit information in, and she will get a paper check. And so a lot of these, I think, checks that are going to be delayed until September are probably for a very vulnerable part of our population. And I was just kind of wondering if there was some way to speed it up, or what your guys' thought is on kind of that time frame. And it kind of goes back to another discussion of what we had where, administering payments is the IRS's deal, but now they're kind of operating as a social welfare distributor.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like this is what we had all kind of anticipated when we first started talking about this, about how they had made big claims about how it was going to, and how, in reality, oftentimes with government, those things don't end up happening as quickly as they seem, and just how difficult it is to administer aid that's needed in a really tight timeline, but with, all these drastic changes happening. And so, yeah, I think it sounds terrible, but also exactly like what I would have imagined would happen with trying to implement such a drastic measure, in such a short time frame. What do you think, Ty?
Yeah, I guess it's not, my head's been so into business that these individual checks really hasn't been on my radar. So yeah, I mean, I can imagine people are somewhat disappointed. I mean, I guess the exposure I do have to that is I do have a former client who was, I do have a couple of former clients who were looking at trying to get information on various things to complete tax returns so they can get the stimulus checks. They're really kind of like anxious for that. And so, yeah, this is an interesting point in terms of, well, with all their angst on trying to file a tax return so they can get the stimulus checks, based on what you're saying, they're still not going to get it for several months anyway.
Yeah, I mean, even, in best case scenario, even if they do have your stuff, you may not get it for another month, and it was supposed to cover some kind of stimulus to cover lost wages and lost time and effort spent for people that are out of work and maybe having to make payments. And so, yeah, I mean, even the quickest way they can get them to us is delayed, just because of the timing of this, where the IRS is releasing refunds on top of stimulus checks. I just can't imagine being an IRS worker right now. They're probably, and I know there was a hiring freeze for a long time at the IRS. So I imagine they're probably overworked and probably unsung in this whole thing.
I agree completely. Yeah, it sounds like not fun for anybody involved. But yeah, hopefully they're able to get their ducks in a row and get the checks out. Do you guys have any other ideas on how maybe the government could have ran this in a more streamlined way, or maybe there's a better approach to these type of entitlements to get that money out to people?
I did actually. That the sporting events, when they have those T-shirt cannons, I thought they could just load it up with cash and kind of drive around to everybody's house and shoot it at them.
It's certainly more fun, but they did ban the sporting events, so what can we do?
Sports anthem kind of blaring out of loudspeakers and just a rain of cash on my front lawn. That would be fun.
I'll take it. No. So yeah, we got that, and I got one more article we can discuss. Again, kind of related to the whole, you can't find anything in the news these days if it's not coronavirus related, but we're talking about how it affects different businesses. And so I thought it would be interesting to take a look at a business who has been affected by coronavirus and what seemed like a good thing and then ended up being a bad thing, which is actually Zoom, the software that we're using to do this call right now. Basically what happened is that as everybody was forced to work from home, the Zoom's user count just skyrocketed, and it had already been having some growing pains, but this has really accelerated it. And so some of the issues that they've been reporting on is that they found that people were Zoom bombing, which means that the people have found a way to join Zoom meetings that they weren't invited to that are open, and then they'll take control of the host computer and try to use it to do malicious activity or whatever. And then there was also some debate about, not debate, but there was some controversy around the fact that Zoom had implied that they were using end-to-end encryption, but it turned out that they weren't. And so And then there was another thing about them sharing more data with Facebook than they led users to believe. And so, yeah, I guess I just wanted to talk a little bit about how some businesses grow too quickly when something like this happens, and, you know, how coronavirus affects every business in such a unique and different way. Yeah.
I just like to put it out there that we're still open to we still like Zoom, and we're still open to a Zoom sponsoring the podcast. So Zoom representatives, please call us. Our number's in the inbox there. We're more than willing to sing your praises about how easy and effective your video conferencing app is.
Yeah, I mean, we signed up for Zoom initially real quick in order to specifically to facilitate the podcast. I was doing some interviews. We were doing interviews with people who were not in our same town and across the country and so on. And so looking for the right video conferencing app for that purpose. And that's ultimately Zoom seemed like a great choice for that. And that's why we chose it. And then from there with the coronavirus, we just kind of implemented across the board with how we do the rest of our business too. I think what's interesting about Zoom, I mean, what I think about on this, what's interesting about Zoom is that it's not the only show in town for video conferencing, and yet it's become like the really popular go-to app across the business world. And it reminds me a little bit of Slack, right? That you've got these like certain apps that just like catch fire. Their generic functionality is already done many times over. Like similar to Slack, there are other messaging platforms and communication platforms that you could be using, but it's like the unique, it's hard to articulate, right? It's like the unique way in which the interface and the way they set up the options and the streamlined way in which some of these softwares operate allow them to really catch fire. And I think that's kind of the story with Zoom, is that it has a certain kind of interface and ease to it. And then on top of that, it snowballs when everybody else in your network is using it. They already know how to use it. So it makes sense from a business perspective for you to use what everyone else is using, because there's less training and uptime if we're all using the same kind of platform. So yeah, it's just an interesting business phenomena how as businesses and industry will all jump on a particular app like this, where the functionality is actually kind of found in other apps as well.
Well, I think there's something kind of interesting in both of those cases, in both Zoom and Slack. And then another one that I've seen the same kind of thing in is the website Reddit. But a lot of these tools are built with like integrations in mind. And so like, for example, with Zoom, I know a big thing is like it integrates with Outlook well, so that you can send calendar invites that link to the meeting and are just easy for people. Slack has kind of the same thing with a lot of other different Salesforce apps and things that you can connect to it. And so I think that that's one of those things that helps these apps really catch on like wildfires, when they integrate well with other services that, like you said, people are already on, already using, already comfortable with. And so it becomes easy to add. And I think that, yeah, that's one of those big themes, is that developers who take their app seriously enough to make it integratable with other apps are, you know, allow themselves the runway to catch on that way, you know.
And I can speak from personal experience. The reason why I prefer Zoom, and to be honest, I don't really care about the end-to-end encryption. You know, none of that really bothers me as far as I'm concerned, because usually what I'm talking about on these Zoom meetings is either going to be broadcast to the world or is not privy information. But I guess that would matter in a sensitive information kind of arrangement. But I think the real reason why Zoom kind of is the preferred method of delivery for a video conferencing app is because of the ease of use and the, you know, like kind of user interface, and what a difference that makes in the availability. Because we tried other video conferencing options like Google Hangouts and various other ones, Skype and all that stuff, and the ease of use in which Zoom allows you to save a recording of the conversation and to have a transcript of what was said afterwards delivered to you, I think matters more than Facebook is going to get your information anyway. So I don't know. I don't think that probably it's probably not good PR for them, but I don't think that this will actually end up hurting them just because it is kind of an industry standard and has been.
Yeah, and I would counter kind of some of, because I think feature set would be the obvious reason, but the reality is that you know, and I haven't invested the time, and that's the problem. We haven't invested the time in these other platforms, so I'd be careful about assuming that the other platforms don't necessarily have equivalent feature sets. I think that's what's interesting about it is that we don't invest the time to even find out. But I think it is driven by the network effects, right? The fact that because we know other users are using it, it's just going to be faster and more efficient for us to figure this one out than to have to go figure out the same features on some other application. And so I personally think that has a lot to do with it. And I think that to the extent that feature set matters, it's a lot more nuanced than just can you record or not. Because for example, I think we can record on the other platforms. And so I think it is more new. I think it's more nuanced there. And I would argue that the differences between a lot of apps like that probably, in my view, are more subjective. I know I get a lot of comments from people saying, no, it's not. Objectively, Zoom is better for the following reasons, or no, it's not. Objectively, Skype is better for the following reasons. But I think you could find lots of people who would debate either side of that. And that makes my point that it's not objectively really the case that feature set is the primary driver. It's how it's deployed. When you say usability, I totally agree, but it's more nuanced than whether the exact feature is there. It's kind of how is it accessed, or where is it in the user interface, and things like that that are more subjective and maybe harder to define.
So do you think it's more like an Apple and Android kind of solution where you're hooked into that ecosystem or you're a network user?
Oh, I think absolutely that drives that is at least 80% of the answer. And then yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Well, and I think Zoom has that factor you're talking about even more because it's a product that is intended to be used by multiple people at the same time. So you might sit down and use Android versus iOS because to you that's what you think is best, and that's all that's all you care about. But if you were having to regularly have someone else use your phone, then their ability to use becomes obviously a huge factor. And right. So it has that extra characteristic where every time you call, it's not just you, it's what that other person's going to be able to click on and do. And so right. Yeah, so usability. Yeah. So yeah, I just an article, but that's about all we can really say about it. So yeah,
like I said, my DMs are still open.
Have we covered the field guides of articles today?
I think so.
I think now we just wait and hang out on the call for a hacker to show up in the call and end it for us,
Right. Yeah. And hopefully not corrupt our computers or steal our video.
Exactly.
This is where Ethan puts in something cute.
I want to thank everyone again for joining us this episode of None of Our Businesses from our homes during the COVID-19 crisis. Another great roundtable discussion with Charlie Zygmunt, AJ Wheeler, and myself, Ty Carr. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Comment down below if there's things you would like us to cover or talk about in the future, or other ideas you have. Hit the likes and share this with your friends and family. Perhaps on your next Zoom call, tell people about the None of Our Businesses podcast. Okay, everyone, thank you, and we'll see you next time.
All right, see you.
Thank you.